there.
Great to be here, Allie.
You know, I thought you were exactly the right person to ask. Who here has heard of the SaaSpocalypse? Okay, I don't know if I've ever seen every single hand go up quite that quickly. So how apocalyptic is the SaaSpocalypse really?
Yeah, great question. I only get asked that 48 times a day.
Is this the 49th?
It is actually. The important thing to think about, we of course in our world of enterprise software deal with continuous waves of innovation. And then each time there's a wave that's introduced, there actually creates a massive disruption because, oh man, that's going to eliminate fill in the blank. Many of you recall this thing called hosted or the cloud. That's going to eliminate enterprise software. What did it do? It ushered in the greatest expansion of value of enterprise software. And I like to say, enterprise software is the most valuable tool that's been introduced in our business economy in the last 50 years, likely will be for the next 50. It is now enabled by this new thing, this new technology. And the way I like to think about it in the world of enterprise software, we'll unpack this a little bit. Companies will become agentic, or they can become what I call rule of 70. Many of you are familiar with the rule of 40, which is the combination of the growth rate and the EBITDA margin. But these tools actually enable an expansion of margin and an acceleration of growth in many cases. And so those are the two states you're after. But there is a state of enterprise software that becomes, we call it, the PC word is challenged. Ultimately, they don't
Challenged.
they don't have a right to exist. And if you have a business that basically has been aggregating data from public sources, and we like to say make pretty pictures, i.e. data analytics around that sort of thing, those sort of businesses actually don't have a right to exist because that data is all absorbed into these models. And as you and I were chatting, less than 1% of enterprise data has actually been used to train these large models. And if you are a smart, and I'll say it that way, executive, you're not going to take your data to the models. And in fact, Satya talked about this at Davos this year. He said that's the topic for 2026 that executives need to focus on is you are going to leach enterprise value if you take your data to the models. What you need to do is bring those models to your data in your environment in a way that in some cases is air-gapped, it's protected, it's enabled for your use so you can keep your intellectual property, you can keep the value and innovate off that to create new products and solutions for your customers.
What is the split like between companies that are evolving agentically and those that don't have a right to exist?
Yeah, it all depends, right? I know what our split is in our portfolio, but everyone's
What's the split in your
different.
portfolio?
So the first two, we've got, I'll call it about 8% in that no right to exist, and then 92, call it in the rest. There's some blending that occurs at the top. So certain companies that I was like, man, I'm not sure that really has a right to exist. I've been surprised in that one of the things we did is we built an agentic factory. So, 3.5, almost 4 years ago, as we were getting introduced to this new technology, we said, let's adopt the same sort of approach that we took when we had this hosted model come out. And in 2013, we, of course, almost all software was kind of on-prem. There was a hosted environment that was popping up. There was, a shortage of compute. Sounds familiar. The only place that actually had distributed compute of size and scale was this place called AWS. And so I met this guy by the name of Andy Jassy, and nobody knew who this guy was. And I said, hey,
Different time.
Yeah, different time. I said, hey, one of the things we're doing is we want to build a factory to go from on-prem to cloud and, multi-hosted or multi-tenant hosted cloud. And I said, but I need compute. And I will put them on your platform, but you got to guarantee me compute. And he's like, man, we're scarce in compute. I said, yeah, I understand. He said, well, how much? I said, I don't know. I have no idea because this is new. And so we struck that deal again, over 12 years ago or so. And I think we're one of the largest. We've converted more businesses from on-prem to cloud, I think, than any institution on the planet that I know of, and one of the largest customers of there as a result of that. But again, we tuned our factory in that first instance for the AWS platform, and then 18 months later, Satya came around and said, hey, we've got this new thing called Azure. It's a cloud. Can you, move stuff over here? So we had to build another instance of that factory to do that. I say all that to say we had a 2.5 times economic rent pickup from on-prem to cloud. And so now we said, well, let's build another factory. Let's build a factory to go from cloud to agentic. And so we built out a agentic factory. And then part of that, we ended up with Agentic Lab, which we'll talk about a little bit later. What that led to was a whole bunch of insights and call it compounding insights. Rather than 2.5 times pickup, our agentic systems can deliver an order of magnitude higher in terms of the terminal value ultimately of the companies that can become agentic. A company that was doing $400,000 in SaaS revenue now can put on top of that another 500,000 in agentic infrastructure components and agents that can terminate at 2.5 to 3 million with, again, more economic rent for your customers. So you think about that's the inflection rate that we're seeing in going from a cloud to an agentic system. So that's the dynamic.
I was going to say, this seems to be spiritually related. You've been investing in inference infrastructure. Recently, you stood up a network of data centers devoted to controlling inference costs.
Right.
Why that bet?
It is more the essential nature of what I'll call keeping the profitability. So when you have a new technology come into the marketplace, you have to think about the effect of it, I call it on the stock, i.e. the companies that you own. We own over 90 software companies. And we said, okay, if we convert them to agentic, what does that look like? Compounding insights again. We think there's about 4 different agentic types that we've discovered. We have 54 of our 93 companies that have gone through our factory. Each of these 4 agentic types have a different inference consumption pattern. Okay, because if it's monitoring
very quickly, what are the 4 types?
One is called the worker that never sleeps. It's basically measuring, something every single day. One's a smart sidekick, something that you might use every day. The other one's kind of does a heavy lift. It's a heavy workload type of a product. Another one is an orchestrator, right? So it has to orchestrate multiple agents, can spin up agents and all that. Anyway, each of those have a different inference consumptive pattern. And you all have seen now the cost of inference was provided by a very narrow group of folks and people. When you really need it, the price can be 6x from what it was. So all of the value that you are actually creating through creating agentic infrastructure and agentic companies, then basically is extracted to the inference provider as you're buying tokens. So we said, well, gee, we need a way to solve that problem. So that's what this led to. I won't go down the full path, but ultimately we looked at 2 or 3 different other environments. And we said, you know what, the right answer was to go with the company, you've met the CEO, Rodrigo, Samba Nova. Okay,
Spoke
why?
earlier today.
Yeah, I carry this around because I tease.
You carry it around all the time?
This is air-cooled, not liquid-cooled. 1/15 the power consumption. We get between 7 and 20 times the throughput. And so as a result of that, we can go into an existing data center, brownfield convert it, and actually deliver inference to our own portfolio companies first, and have the ability, we have capacity, and we can deliver it at a lower cost, so we can actually preserve the margin for our portfolio companies as opposed to have it all extracted by the inference providers. So that's the dynamic that led to us building out now what we call a VC2, which is an inference cloud that is based on this platform.
What do you think is the biggest misconception about AI right now?
Biggest misconception?
Particularly that
it can
investors
do,
are getting
it's
wrong.
kind of funny, like all things, people think it could do everything, but you remember, you got to understand, you all probably know this, hopefully in this audience, this is a probabilistic system, whereas in the enterprise, you need deterministic answers. And so you actually have to create I'll call it a conversion, mechanism to go from probabilistic, utilizing the capabilities, tools, speed, capability of what these systems can deliver to give you a deterministic answer. And I like to say, in a business environment, you don't want your wire transfer mostly right? You need things precise.
It's pretty binary.
Yeah, right? So you've got to build a system, which is what our factory does with each of our portfolio companies. And from that, you can get deterministic outcomes, and you can do it what we call in an air-gapped environment. So you aren't leaking intellectual property the way you underwrite, the way you manage risk, the way you manage your portfolio, to a model that can therefore, take to someone else. And that's, again, what Satya talked about. It's like, I like to think about it, you have a vault, which is where all your data and information is, and you're going to let somebody drive up in an armored car, newly minted, hey, let me give you my data. You go do something that I don't know what you're going to do and how it gets done, and you bring back some answer to me. Certain regulated environments, of course, that does not work. But why would you do that? Because now they have all of the insights and data and information in their system that a competitor, if prompted properly, can gain access to. So we have found corporations are now saying, we want to ensure that we have the ability to, contain and the context, the trust, the security, and the scale in our environment for the business that we own and that we run. And that's, in essence, part of the thesis behind what we are doing with our enterprise software businesses.
We're going to turn to the audience for questions soon, but you last raised a $20 billion fund. You're known for software. The conversation around software, you could say it's evolved over the last 12 to 24 months.
Yeah.
How has that affected your deployment pace, if at all?
It is. We have slowed deployment now because we needed to ensure we had the capability to keep the economic rent from creating these agentic systems. So we've got a brilliant team in our agentic factory, in our agentic lab. We're like, great, we now can create this agentic system that gives you 20x economic rent pickup from what you were doing before. But if you have to spend, X amount of tokens that eliminates all that value, it's not worth, the ride isn't worth the slide, as we say. So we needed to build an infrastructure, which we now have
Is that
built.
what they say?
That's what they say if you're skiing, right? You ride up, is it worth the slide if it's no snow? I mean, we had to deal with this year in Colorado. Anyway, that's a Colorado joke. I'm from Colorado. Sorry. Anyway, it's all about chairlifts. Anyway, the whole. At the end of the day, what we need to have is the ability to control the outcomes of the businesses that we own and now underwrite. Stock and flow. The flow is now the new underwriting. We now have the ability to underwrite differently because we have the ability to contain and capture the economic rent created by the agents that we now build for our company.
Questions for Robert? We have one in the front here.
Oh, we got a front row question. These are always
front row
tough.
question.
Yeah, that's somebody who studied.
Name and who you're with.
So I'm Wen, co-founder and CEO at Genspark.ai. We're an AI agent company in Palo Alto. So my question for Robert is, clearly companies are raising money in a different environment. What have your frameworks of evaluating companies changed? Because we're seeing seed rounds of hundreds of millions of dollars. And for us, we published, our B round was 385. Like,
Right.
what are you, how are you changing your kind of framework?
Yeah, the dynamic, so we have a very, I call it central thesis that actually hasn't changed and it's built so it can evolve. It is critical factors for success being under our control. That's exactly what we do. Okay, we want to make sure that whatever it is that creates success in the enterprise business is under our control. Look, there are certain things that will come. Certain of the businesses, like I said, that 8% was, oh, wait a minute, 5 years ago, that was a great business because nobody could aggregate data like we could and sell it like we could because of distribution. Now all of a sudden, ooh, they got these things out there that'll do it called an LLM, right? But when I think about it today, our ability to actually create agentic systems within our portfolio companies, within the unique workflows that we control, okay, for the data that sits and resides in the environment of our customers, and then have the ability to deliver a low-cost token inference capability, you now have the ability to preserve the margin for the enterprise agentic solution. So we underwrite to that. This is something different than what we looked at even a year ago. So that's the dynamic that has changed for us. That is our central thesis.
Well, and sort of to this, and I'd actually be really curious, what is one software category that you think's totally going to make it, and another that you're like, I'm not seeing it?
So the easy stuff is, these highly regulated businesses, because you actually have to trace and be accounted, account for how you went from point A to point Z, right? Okay. And those dynamics are elements that have to be captured, and the probabilistic nature in those environments. If you're not capturing it, then you can have a problem with regulators. So a broad category in and around that. Again, those that are just aggregating data and information. The way I like to characterize it, those don't have a right to exist. So highly contextual. Okay, we have a company, ESO. It's for emergency response, and you say, oh well, can you agentify that? Well, no, because every emergency response system out there, the ambulance that's used, you need to know, did it pass the checklist? You don't want an ambulance coming to your house that didn't pass the checklist because their oxygen bottles weren't changed out or filled. That's a very local, highly contextualized activity that has to physically occur for it actually to say this should be enabled as a system. So those who are call it, have the dominion over that, we call it sovereignty and dominion over the workflows and data sets in those environments, not only have a right to exist, but actually have a right to expand and be, frankly, extend their addressable market and capture more economic rent associated with the work that they do.
Now, SpaceX is going public this week. I don't know if
I heard.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody's heard. OpenAI and Anthropic have both confidentially filed. How do you see that string of IPOs, potential IPOs, having an effect on software? What are some of the after effects you're seeing in the market more generally? or
Yeah,
imagining in the market more
that's
generally?
it's interesting. Like our capital markets person, Ashley McNeil, who was capital markets at Morgan Stanley for many years. She's been with us, I think, 5, 6 years now. She's like, it's everything. It's SpaceX and then everything after, right? I mean, the size, capacity, the impact, the trading volume. It is reshaping that whole market in, you can call it good or bad ways, but you think about it, and I was laughing this morning with a friend of mine. It's like everybody I know who owns it is selling, and everybody who's not in it is buying, right? So I think it's going to be a successful. And we went through the whole list, internally, and what the implications are, and then you're like, well, why would anybody do it? It's like because no one wants to bet against Elon, right? And so I mean that's kind of the dynamic that we're seeing. That with all that said, there is going to be a massive demand for infrastructure to support this call it this deployment of this new general purpose technology, of which each of those three plays a critical role. Um, with all that said, some of these large scale LLMs you don't necessarily need in the enterprise environment. Um, you have a bank of PhDs. Sometimes you just need 5 really smart high school students to get it precisely right every single time. For certain environments, for managing it might be an insurance claim, or managing the fact that somebody's calling in and telling you you've got a pothole that needs to be fixed, and 40 people are calling to tell you the same thing, right? You don't need PhD scientists for that, right? So it's a lot of it has to do with the context, and so part of what we will see as this phase occurs is we'll say, okay, here's a context where you need certain capabilities, and here's a context where you need different capabilities, solving different sorts of medical issues, et cetera. So those are the dynamics that I think we'll see play out, and each of those companies has a role. Elon, of course, is believing that there's a capacity to deliver very low cost inference ultimately through different deployments and space and cars and those sort of things. And
Colossus.
yeah, well, he's rented a bunch of that right now out to Dario, but at some point in time, like, okay, that's enough. I need it back. But that's a dynamic that we'll let those two figure out.
To wrap up, I wanted to end by looking back.
Yeah.
You started your career as an intern at Bell Labs,
Yeah.
which gave us the foundation of much of the modern digital economy.
Yeah.
So you've seen a technical revolution sort of from the inside. Is this one
This is the biggest I've ever seen.
bigger than the transistor, what you saw at the end of that golden era at Bell Labs?
I mean, so I used to ask this question of my children at the dinner table: what is the most, profound technological development in human history? And so, of course, printing press. I would always argue, the transistor. I think as they get older, they may argue it's AI. Of course, like all these things, they're kind of archaeological digs. You're putting one on top of the other. Like our careers, we were talking about it. I'm sitting here today. I started my career working in semiconductor testing, and here I am, a few years later, you know, focused on how do we ensure that we have utilized this capability. We were at the time 7-layer boards. I think we're 42 layers for this particular instance. But there's just these learnings that are important, which comes to a little bit of the second point, which is the importance of internships. We all talk about the jobs, and look, agents are workers. Workers do tasks. Some of those tasks get aggregated into jobs, and there is going to be a massive impact on jobs. No question about it. Some may say a big loss, some may be an expansion. There's going to be some mix till we reach different states of equilibrium. That's just how life is. But I would continue to encourage all of you and businesses that you operate and own to make sure you do not destroy your intern programs. That's an important part of bringing people along and honestly creating optimism, and a new group of technologists and people and and thinkers who can hopefully carry this world forward, so that when we retire to go fishing in Colorado, we can sleep a little better at night. So that's how I'd leave it.
Before we leave, Robert, future of software in one word.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you all.